Our scene begins aboard the bridge of the USS Acheron, above a red planet somewhere near the Klingon border. Her transporters work double time to evacuate the survivors of a crashed freighter on the planet's surface. Earlier this season, her crew, through hard-won efforts, was able to create an algorithm that allows them to detect Klingon ships approaching at warp, even while cloaked. Duotronic beeps and whirs alert Darius Merrick at the Navigator's console of her bridge to an approaching Klingon vessel, D7 class. He informs Captain Karkov of the danger, and a combat scenario in Star Trek Adventures begins. Today we're going to go boldly into the world of starship combat in Star Trek Adventures. This is a deep topic, and it's one that I've been wary of entering into because of how incredibly deep it is. And that the rulebook often will point you in three different directions in order to figure out how to do something, how to accomplish a given end. And with that in mind, I do recognize that there is a need for a video like this. So I've worked myself up to it. Now let's get started. First, we need to imagine a situation where the ship is going to be in a crisis. It's going to be reaching towards combat. We're going to imagine that there are some characters on the bridge. Let's imagine that we are playing Star Trek Adventures with 3 humans at the table with us, since there aren't any other species here on Earth, so far as we know, and they're playing 3 main character officers. Let's say that one of them is playing a young and brash captain who's been promoted on merit, and another is his friend, the Vulcan science officer, and the third is a cantankerous foil, the ship's doctor, to the 2. So those are the 3 humans and their main characters in a starship combat situation. And as you paint the scene as the game master, you may want to point out that this is a scenario where the doctor's player may want to activate a supporting character and use that character in the primary role within this scene. And you can sketch this out in narrative description, or you could even look him right in the eye and be explicit about it, that this is an opportunity for a supporting character to come into the picture. Perhaps that character could be a young Russian helmsman. Aboard the bridge of the player character's starship, there will be various roles, and within each of those roles, there are actions that can be performed which kind of meet the archetypes of various things that people do in starship combat, like raising and lowering the shields, modulating them, dispatching damage control teams, and a whole host of other things that we're going to get into. Those roles are then accumulated into stations. These are physical places on the bridge that your character will be sitting at. So Captain Kirk is sitting in the commanding officer's station. And likewise, we might imagine that Hikaru Sulu is sitting at a console which subsumes both a helmsman and a navigator role. And our young Russian helmsman is sitting at a helm console that also has tactical role functions. Each of these consoles can have 2 to 3 roles accumulated into them. And so from a given chair on the bridge, you can do differing activities from several different areas. And you can get up and use a minor action on your turn to change to a different console. Yes, that's right. Uh, Initiative, at least as far as the player characters are concerned, functions in exactly the same fashion as it did in person-to-person combat. So a character on the player character's side will go first. I recommend that the game master designate that the captain is the one to pick in these kind of situations where combat is about to escalate. He can sketch out the course of action and even provide an inspiring speech to build some momentum, or perhaps use a direct action to be bold in the moment and get the ball rolling right away. Suffice it to say, the game master will normally, by default, choose a player character to act first. Once their turn is complete, which could include up to 2 tasks using a swift task, then a character from the opposing side will go, and then a character from the player character side will go, and so on until all the characters in the scene have acted. Now, this gets a little bit interesting because you may be in a situation where you have your main character that you're playing, and you may have a supporting character that you're also playing. They're both on screen at the same time. Remember, you need to decide which of these two is the primary character, and then that's the one who's going to act, and then the secondary inactive character will be the one that acts with them on their turn, but can only attempt tasks that are difficulty 0. This is still going to matter because there are a lot of difficulty 0 tasks which form and play a big part in the Starship combat system. So I go, you go. And then one of my friends goes, possibly with another character that he's controlling at the same time. And then you go. And so on, the initiative system goes. Retain initiative is an option which costs 2 momentum. And that way you can get 2 characters on your side going in sequence before another acts on the opposing side. Now, NPC initiative over on the beshadowed hull of the enemy ship might work a little bit differently, and I will approach that in a little while. Suffice it to say, I want to get things very clear on how player characters will act on the bridge. So you're sitting at a console, and you need to pick various actions on your turn to try and do things to the situation. This might include scanning. This might include damage control teams. Next, let's talk about where the ships are. They are in zones and they're moving around in space. These can be abstract, kind of descriptive things like in low orbit over a Class M world, in deep space approaching the Class M world, or just behind the moon in a close and hidden area. These are various sorts of ways of describing it. You can get out a map and draw these, and I'll show an example of that in a little while. Using their engines and a helmsman, ships can move between zones, and the various range brackets are in contact, literally docked together. You can be in close range, sharing the same zone as a ship. You can be in medium range, which is adjacent zones, and you can be in long range, which is still one zone separating you. So I'm here, there's a zone in between us, and then you're over there. That would be long range. And then extreme range is anything further than that. These categories will matter because they do change the difficulty to attack with various weapon systems. So keep that in mind as a difference between starship combat and personal combat, where ranges don't directly affect attack difficulties. So we already talked at length about how the ship has its own character sheets and its own stat line, its own hit points and injuries in the form of shields and breaches in the introduction to starships video, which is getting a little long in the tooth and is in a different style than how I present stuff nowadays on my channel. But just to recap, your ship has a shields rating, which is effectively sort of like hit points. When the ship is going to take damage, they're going to come off of those shields first. Your ship has a resistance value, which is its basic electronic warfare capabilities, its just sturdiness of its hull, and the stoutness of its build. This is sort of like damage reduction. It's applied before any damage goes through to the shields or otherwise harms the ship. Real telling blows are landed against ships when they take 5 or more points of damage after resistance has been subtracted, or if they're at 0 shields already, so you can do a single point of damage and inflict a breach, or if in the attack they reach 0 shields. You can get 2 of these conditions together. So you could take 5 damage while also reaching 0 shields, in which case you took 2 breaches. You could take 5 damage and your shields were already down, in which case 2 breaches. The damage then gets applied to particular systems aboard your starship. And so you can take damage to your communications, you can take damage to your weapons, to your engines, and differing thresholds of breaches will cause differing amounts of crisis aboard the starship. These are measured by a fraction of the starship's scale rating. So a scale 6 ship, the thresholds are at half of their scale, 3, and at the fullness of their scale, 6. And often a single breach will cause the system to sort of flicker and be offline for a moment until someone can act with a minor action. The various damage states are presented pretty cogently within the rulebook. The thing to keep in mind is that you will be rolling for hit location, one of the systems, when you inflict breaches. And the way to work around that is when you are attacking, you can assume a penalty, a higher difficulty to your attack roll in order to try and damage a specific system. And there are talents to avoid this as well. The targeting system is usually a pretty good talent. Suffice it to say, this means that ships can take a beating because across 6 different systems, you can take something like 8 breaches and still be flying. And this really captures a lot of the hornblower in space, Nicholas Meyer kind of starship combat that we saw in The Wrath of Khan and in The Undiscovered Country. So now let's delve in deep to the various positions aboard the starship bridge and what sort of actions and tasks can be attempted by these differing people at these consoles. Let's start in the commanding officer's chair. One of the things that he can do is sketch out a plan. He can enable his crewmates to do something which is outside of all of the list of things that I'm going to talk to you about and which are options already on the paper by creating an advantage. A trait can, after all, make things possible that are impossible. So don't be restricted by everything that's going to come after in this video, because this system does provide the facilities to do things which aren't strictly possible within the granular framework. Now, keep that in mind. So, create advantage could reduce the difficulties by sketching out a plan like attack pattern Omega, photon torpedoes full spread. Another option from the commanding officer's chair is to direct. Rather than attempting a task on their turn, they can direct another character to apply themselves to whatever's at their station. And when you do this, you give a free assist to the character that you've directed. So, of course, Mr. Worf, fire at will, or lay in a course 114 Mark 7, warp 2, engage, might be a direct task aimed towards the Helmsman lieutenant. These are some options for the ways to act very quickly before the combat gets away from you. It could be a way to run away or to strike first when the game master has called on the captain to be the first person to act within the combat. Finally, from the commanding officer's chair, the CO can rally. He can give some sort of inspiring speech to his comrades. He could get over the shipboard, ship-wide intercom, and the little whistle will go, and he'll give some sort of stirring speech which will build the momentum pool. And that's really all it'll do, but it'll be a task at difficulty 0. One of the things to note here is that it can be possible to have a captain character in the commanding officer's chair that is a supporting character in the inactive role, because this is difficulty 0 stuff. So don't feel obliged to always have the captain be primary in these scenes, and you may just have a party makeup within your group that may mean that supporting character captains might be on the table. For more about how that might work, go ahead and have a look at this video right here. Starships are full of amazing and untold power, but they don't do a great deal of good if they're not pointing in a direction and flying towards whatever it is that they need to defend or attack or run away from. The helmsman is the one who's responsible for this. The helm consoles are typically operated by control plus con tasks, and often at difficulty 0. Again, an opportunity for a supporting character in the inactive role to be taking care of these things. The options are to maneuver using the maneuvering thrusters, and with this, you can move anywhere within medium range. So you can move one zone from where you are to anywhere within any zone that's one zone away. So you could go from where you are to behind the moon. You could go from where you are to deep into the gas giant's atmosphere using maneuvering thrusters. this takes no power. Yes, we are going to get into that quantity, which is generated by the ship's engine. It's another reserve of kind of tokens and also another quantity to track, like hit points about the ship. And I will be speaking about it a little bit more, but suffice it to say, the next option on the Helmsman's menu is Impulse. Using this, he can move anywhere within long range. In other words, up to 2 zones. This will cost 1 power. You could also engage the warp drive, and spending power equal to the number of zones, you can do the same thing. The thing to keep in mind here is that these can be tasks that build momentum. So, in spite of the fact that the next action I'm going to tell you is called evasive action, you can, using the momentum that you've generated from just steering the ship in a handy and confident fashion using these tasks, that momentum can go into the pool and can be used later for things like uh, making the tactical officer's shooting more accurate because he's in a good position. It could be used on the spot as a create problem spend in order to increase the difficulty of an enemy attack. So, the thing to keep in mind here is that even a difficulty 0 task can subsume a lot of these actions, and often, since it will be the only helm action for the turn, it often includes all of this notionally in your imagination. You can think of how these moments that might happen later in the round are the result of the actions of a confident and competent helmsman. With that being said, the bolder and fancier task for a helm character to attempt is evasive action. Using their daring, they can increase difficulty of attacks against your ship by 1. The difficulty of this task is 1, and it will increase the difficulty of your own ship's attacks for the duration of its effect, which is pretty much until it's time for this character to act again. It will also expend 1 power. The counterpart to evasive action is attack pattern. Similarly, with daring plus con, this time at difficulty 2, and assisted by the ship's weapons in this case, you are able to reduce the difficulty for the tactical officer. So you're lining things up and getting things in a row, especially for photon torpedoes, which have a pretty high difficulty to hit. This may be very important, or if you want to fire a lot of salvos from the ship, if you want to do many tasks involving weapons, then attack pattern may be a pretty good option. Attack pattern is likewise a pedal to the metal maneuver that costs a point of power. Ramming speed is a dire and frankly not frequently exercised option. It might be the sort of thing that the helmsman might use if there's a cloud of asteroids, if you're using the Starship combat system for a descriptive sort of scenario, which is not combat per se, but just a crisis. But I'm not going to talk about it at length. It's stated cogently in the rulebook should you ever have need for it. At the Navigator's console, the 2 tasks which are available by default are Plot Course and Chart Hazard. They're both quite difficult, but Plot Course is also pretty useful in that it can bring down the helmsman's difficulties. That's useful. And the other thing to keep in mind about the Navigator's console is that don't feel restricted to what's on this list. The Navigator could certainly do other things involving kind of a tactical awareness of the situation. I would like to imagine that the Navigator may also be in something of a CIC role to direct fighter craft and shuttles that are incoming and outgoing, or may even be involved in the combat as well. So there are things that you could do that would be real tasks and change the shape of the combat, create traits, possibly increase or decrease the difficulty of things, or make impossible things possible or possible things impossible using the power of what you have at your disposal in the Navigator's console. I mention this because it's a pretty lightweight station, but at the same time, this fellow was one of my favorite characters in the TOS cast when I was growing up. In the sensor operator's role, the basic action is sensor sweep at difficulty 0. This is a reason plus science task, and it's a way to build up the momentum pool to get an understanding of the opposition or what sort of terrain you might use to hide behind in order to stay alive, and other options. Suffice it to say, it's another great option for an inactive supporting character or an NPC to undertake. And yes, you can have NPCs on your bridge, and they are your friends for the most part, so they will be generating momentum when they do act. This is something that I would recommend leaving to the end of the combat round if you do have NPCs, because the idea there is that they'll be picking up where the player characters leave off. The player characters can shout orders at them, and if the combat is lasting that long and you want to have more actions in a single round, then this is a good way for characters to not feel bored, is that they can coordinate closely with an NPC crew member. And of course, you might be just playing with fewer people at your table, in which case, by all means, maybe there is a B shift tactical lieutenant who's available. Remember to kind of always have a logical number of people on the bridge when you spring combat on your player characters. But enough of sidetracks. The next action, which is more difficult for the sensor operator, is called Scan for Weakness. And with it, he can really buff the ability of a tactical officer's shot to really make a telling blow. If your ship is facing another ship that's of a significantly higher scale and thus has a high resistance value, this might be a necessary action. So those times that you're facing off against a Borg cube or a Doridex warbird, and you're in a lowly Miranda class starship, then you may want to call upon the sensor operator to scan for weakness. And finally, another thing that the sensor operator can do is make those pesky things about line of sight go away. And by that, I mean you can launch a probe. You can send a probe out, and with it, you can see around another obstacle. You could probe into an anomaly without endangering your ship. And this is another one of those places where the Starship Combat System, I feel, is really good at providing a resource for crisis situations where the ship is in danger that aren't necessarily combat. This next role deals with things that are going on inside of the ship, and it's called security oversight. And I certainly think that Worf does perform this role from his console, but we often see Deanna performing some portions of this role from her console when she's in combat situations with the ship. And for my part, it does seem like maybe Uhura is also directing some of these activities from her console on the original series. The first thing that you can do is internal sensors. You can try and figure out what's going on inside your ship. If you've been beamed aboard, if there's alien goopiness which is creeping about, or perhaps Borg nanoprobes, this is how you might ascertain something about what's happening. And this can be an opportunity for a question and answer period with the game master. Remember how I talked about power tokens for the starship? Well, this might be a good opportunity to spend some of them to do a very rigorous scan, which can provide a lot of questions and answers so that you can get on with the danger of this situation and resolving it. From the security oversight console, you can also deploy security. Using difficulty 1 presence plus security task, you dispatch a security team and they are off on their way to neutralize borders or otherwise respond to a threat. And if it's achieved, they've responded. Whether that means their threat is eliminated or just contained, and you might be able to call them for an update next round, is a narrative sort of question. Suffice it to say, I haven't seen a lot of boarding scenarios unfold as part of the Starship Combat System, but these are some of those facilities that are at your disposal for when combat and things other than combat start to intermingle. On the Star Trek shows that are a little bit later in the timeline, another way that they often respond to problems involving intruders is to erect internal containment fields, and it is from this console that you can do so. It is a difficult task. It's a reason plus security, and it could stretch between many different difficulties depending upon the wiliness of whatever sort of threat that you're after. We can recall a very certain time that a young Wesley Crusher was evading these fields, for example. Now, what you've all been waiting for, I'm sure, is what's going on at the tactical console. How do you actually fight them? How do you dispatch your enemies? Let's get into it. First thing is that you can fire your weapons. This is normally a control plus security task, and you're assisted by the weapons and security of the ship for the assist die. Remember that the assist die only counts if the character making the roll generated at least one success. Phasers start at a difficulty of 2, and photon torpedoes start at a difficulty of 3. But there's more to it than that, because different classes of phasers have different preferred ranges. So most of your average phasers in the original series era will have a preferred range of medium, one zone. When they're closer than that, you are going to be at a penalty, and the difficulty will be one higher. If they're further than that, then the difficulty would be one higher. Likewise, phaser cannons, which are the sort of thing that I think we saw in the Wrath of Khan and we definitely saw on the USS Defiant, are the sort of thing that are close range. So, in order to be shot at a difficulty of 2, they need to be sharing a zone with their target. Things further away will be increasingly higher difficulties. Normally, you will be seeing photon torpedoes on your Starfleet vessels beginning at a difficulty of 3, and their preferred range band is long. So this is where you can kind of reach out across vast distances, say between the orbit of Earth and the orbit of Ceres. And those photon torpedoes can reach out that far. You may need to adjust the difficulty downward using something like a target lock advantage in order to actually be able to hit with these. Once you hit, you have the option with photons to use a full spread, which generates additional threat but can do a lot more damage. I'm going to go into more detail about the options and the nuance of how to fire phasers and photon torpedoes, because there's a whole basket of little things that go on once you've fired your weapons. Once I've talked about the other options for the tactical officer. On the defensive side, rather than firing your guns, you can modulate your shields. So long as the shields are up, this will allow you to increase the ship's resistance value. And that's, of course, very critical in avoiding breaches. So if you need to stand tall and stand tough, if you're looking to just suffer the blows of the enemy rather than lash out, possibly because that's not an option, because it's the Starfleet way, then you may want to modulate your shields. This is a way to stay peaceful and possibly just frustrate your enemies. And it's especially relevant when there's a disparity between the scale of the two ships. So if you're small, then you need to modulate your shields in order to avoid suffering some really bad breaches. Likewise, if you are much larger than a small ship, then that advantage of your high resistance can be made even more insurmountable when you're being attacked by lots of small craft. Finally, from the tactical console, you can lash out with a tractor beam, which will immobilize the enemy ship using a difficulty of 2. It needs to be in close range, so this is going to lock the two ships in the same zone with one another. It's a tough place to be, especially when the combat is a bit asymmetric. In order to beat that tractor beam and break out, that is a matter of the power level of the given ship's tractor beam, which is classified by the class of ship. So different ships will have increasingly higher abilities to grab on. And the USS Galaxy class ships have an especially strong tractor beam. After all, we did see a lot of occasions where they were able to reach out and grab and say, not today, to the little puny ships that were troubling them on a given week. So let's dig in a little bit deeper to how it works with phasers and photon torpedoes. First thing to note is that phasers are energy weapons and they cost a point of power in order to fire them. After that first point of power, you can spend additional power to increase the damage by a whole die. The next thing to note about phasers is that they have the versatile quality. And so once you hit, you get some bonus momentum to work with, which you can use to massage the damage or otherwise go wild once you've scored a hit. There are a number of options which I'm going to put up on the screen for what you can do with momentum in combat. That's where the versatile quality comes into play. On the other side of the coin, one of the interesting virtues of photon torpedoes is that they don't cost power. This can leave power available for the helm. This can leave power available for recovering the shields and getting them back up to snuff. However, photon torpedoes are a little bit risky. They often cause damage. On the original series, we occasionally see them concerned that they might get some backsplash damage from their own photon torpedoes. And on TNG, we saw that there were occasions where they fired photons and they obliterated the enemy ship, and it was a really embarrassing kind of loss of life. It was uncalled for, and their superiors would hear about this. And so there's a lot of inherent danger. It represents an escalation. It's bringing a gun to a knife fight in some respects. So when you fire torpedoes, a threat gets added to the pool. Now, you can choose to fire a full spread of torpedoes, which adds an additional 2 more threat, but you roll an additional challenge die on the damage, and you gain the spread effect for your damage. This is where things start to get really ouchy, because spread inflicts an additional hit to a random system on the ship. You will need to roll damage, and it may or may not breach from this secondary hit. But if it does, photon torpedoes have high yield. Anytime they inflict a breach, they instead inflict 2. And so this is how you can end up blowing up a ship outright, is by hitting them with 6 photon torpedoes. And it's just not going to be a good day for them. One thing to note here is that while photon torpedoes don't have a power requirement, they can still get power invested in them under the normal rules for spending power on any ship-assisted task. That bonus momentum that you get once you succeed can be applied to damage and to massaging the results of the attack. So enough about shooting. Let's talk about talking for a little bit. And by that I mean, let's talk about communications and that role on the Starship Bridge. Hailing frequencies open and respond to hail are 2 counterpart tasks which allow you to send an overture to your opponents and get them on the phone with you. And this is a real task, which it is set up at difficulty 0. But for my part, I think that for the most of the time, it merits rolling for it, because it's a place where the quality of the overture is a significant portion of it. That extending that olive branch generates momentum, even if it's denied, in the idiom of the Star Trek genre. Respond to hail is the counterpart. You can pick up the phone and lay down your sword. And in the ensuing conversation that will follow, you have the resource of that momentum that you got from rolling the respond to hail check. And so I recommend that even though these are difficulty 0 tasks, which could seem trivial, I think that it makes sense to actually allow them to be rolled out, because they are a break in the action. They are a place where combat might be opening the door to something else. And so letting that moment where combat is ending fuel whatever comes afterwards in the form of momentum, I find to be good. The communications officer can also try and intercept enemy communications. She can jam enemy communications so that they can't get word out to call for reinforcements, for example. She can gather a damage report. The main purpose of this is that it can reduce the difficulty of damage control tasks for the engineer, either by spreading across a very good result across many damage control attempts, or bringing down a single damage control attempt to a manageable level. This is one of those places where using a very competent main character at the communications console, who's in the primary role, a secondary role supporting character could have their difficulty brought down to 0 where they could attempt it. So this is a place where playing 2 characters at once is absolutely enabled, and you can call upon that resource when you're playing combat. The next role on the bridge is called internal systems, and in many respects, it is the engineer's console. Power management is one of the main tasks that this role has at its disposal. It's a daring or control task, depending on whether you want to cut corners or just be very precise. But the idea here is that you are throttling systems that are in the background of the ship, the life support, the holodecks, the lights in the hallways. You're trying to harvest as much little bits of energy from places where it could do more good if it was in the ship's shields. And this is the important thing to note is that power refreshes fully when scene ends. So the idea here is that there's just the power that you have in your ship when the scene starts, whatever your normal starting amount is. And so getting more back is a matter of rationing. And this is where those fancy speeches about how Janeway tells everyone to cut the power from the life support are actually an important and meaningful part of play. Regenerate shields is a difficulty 1 task, which is 2 if the shields are already down. This is a matter of getting those shield grids, which might be physically damaged, into a situation where they can start to repel attacks again. This is a place where you could spend additional power in order to get more momentum, which is how you can restore more points onto the ship's shields. So this is a power spend, and it might be a power hog, actually. While the ship's engineer might be on the bridge, his damage control teams are all across the ship, fighting valiantly and often sacrificing their lives. Leading those teams and causing the damage control task to get ships back online is a matter of a presence plus engineering task, which he can accomplish from this internal systems console. Finally, from this console, the transporters can be used. This is where we get the basic framework of how difficult using a transporter is in Star Trek Adventures. You will often be using transporters because this is Star Trek, and this is a section that you will probably want to have a close look at in the book to kind of get a good feel for what's required in order to pull it off successfully. It begins at difficulty 2, and it goes up by 1 if you're not on a pad. It goes up by another 1 if the destination is not a pad, and it can go even further based on other situations. You can't beam through your own shields. You can't beam through an enemy whose shields are up. Raising and lowering shields is something of a minor action, which can only be done from the tactical officer's console. So keep all that in mind when it comes to transporters. This is one of those places where rescue missions and where fancy footwork things, which are right at the threshold between combat and crisis situations, which are not combats, are going to come into play. It's a resource that you can use for things besides knockdown, drag out fights. And I'm going to do a whole episode about the transporter in a future video here on the channel. So stay tuned for that one. So it makes sense that a starship combat scene will be playing out mostly on the bridge of the player character's starship. But there are other places on the ship, and anytime that you're able to get in communication with a character elsewhere on a ship, they're still part of the scene. And so in main engineering, all of the tasks that I just talked about on the internal systems console are 1 lower. That means they could reach 0, which has those implications that I've brought up a number of times earlier in this video. Likewise, there are science labs, there's the shuttle bay, there is the sick bay, where we could conceive of a doctor character who might be fighting valiantly against the waves of wounded that are coming in. And likewise, you can physically go to the transporter room, where the consoles are a little bit more optimized, and the difficulty of those tasks I just described are, consistently a little bit lower. So that was an earful and a mouthful for me to talk about all these different options in Starship Combat, but I think that you'll find that it really does embrace the fullness of all the different kinds of bad situations that ships found themselves in over the course of these many Star Trek series that we've had over the years. And it also provides a framework for you to do things besides just 2 ships shooting at each other. So, to summarize, when you want to attack, the tactical officer is making a difficult task, which begins at difficulty 2 for phasers and 3 for photon torpedoes. If that task is successful, then you roll challenge dice, and that's how much damage you're going to do. You can work and hustle with your damage result by spending momentum. You can pick up some of the dice in that pool after having rolled the damage and try and improve it. That costs 1 momentum. You can use the devastating attack spend to kind of do a double tap attack. And then there's this ability to add a spread effect to get a second shot in with your photon torpedoes. All of this means that combat is pretty quick and lethal. You may recall how in the person to person combat video, I said that the half life of combat in the person to person scale is about 1 round. Half of all the combats are done in 1 round. My experience is that with ships down in the scale 4 range, this is also the case. My group has played out an Ares class warship facing off against a D7 class Klingon ship, and it was over very quickly. Now, there's a lot of nuance to what you can do with line of sight and what you can generate in terms of advantages that might make it possible to have a cat and mouse game. It's important to sketch out the space around the starships when you're going to have a Star Trek Adventures starship combat. Meetings in deep space are especially rare, and it's often the terrain that the ships find themselves around that provides the resources for an asymmetrically matched opponent to provide either some peril to the larger opponent or for the little guy to be able to escape and fight another day. Running away is often what ships do in Star Trek Adventures, and that's perfectly okay. Sometimes it's about getting your people home and beamed aboard and getting out before the enemy reinforcements arrive. The red alert klaxons can ring in this starship combat system. You can feel your pulse pounding and the danger building from all directions around you, and the catharsis does not necessarily have to come from seeing the wreckage of your enemies drifting across the battlefield. One thing to keep in mind about the starship combat system is that it is indeed really the pinnacle of system mastery when it comes to Star Trek Adventures. All that complicated stuff that I talked about with playing 2 characters at once, that's hard to do. All this stuff with combat and keeping track of the ship's shields, the ship's power quantities, and so on, it's difficult. It's hard. And this something that you want to keep in mind is that it will take some effort for the group to master this. And so having some scenarios which are almost Starship Combat or smaller versions of Starship Combat, but still very perilous. Things like a rock hurtling towards the ship and the ensuing chaos and damage are ways to practice these parts of the system before you get into a knockdown, drag out fight. Now, I mentioned that aboard NPC starships, the whole paradigm of officer roles and different people at different consoles on the bridge is not quite the same. And there's a simpler option, which is kind of the default for the Game Master side of things, which is that NPC ships have a number of actions equal to their scale. They can do a given action from each role aboard the ship. If they try and do a second action from the same role, then the difficulty of that task will be increased by 1. The stats that inform the tasks that the NPC ships will attempt come from a crew value, which is a simplified kind of rubric of how good the crew aboard the enemy starship is. So they'll just be rolling an attribute plus discipline number that is fixed among them. Once they take damage, they can take a number of breaches up to their scale. And once they've exceeded that, then they're just kind of down for the count. They're withdrawing or they're powering down their weapon systems. Those various ways of expressing that a ship is no longer in the fight that Worf will often inform Captain Picard of when he's standing on the field of victory. You might observe that these NPC starship rules provide a significant advantage to the player character starship. And that's absolutely correct. It provides the opportunity for those kind of hero ship moments where Voyager is a raid against an entire Borg or Kazon armada, where the USS Defiant is cutting through swaths of Jem'Hadar attack ships. And frankly, that's a bit pulpy. It's a bit larger than life, but it is exactly what we saw in a number of Star Trek episodes and a number of the shows. If you're looking for more of the Hornblower-esque, really tense, knockdown, drag out, existential, we might die today in combat kind of fights that balance of terror represents in the original series, that the Wrath of Khan represents, and that we saw several episodes of in Star Trek Enterprise, then I recommend that you develop an NPC crew, a real captain aboard their starship, and you have some face to face time where he drops some nasty threats and you develop him as a character and perhaps even his first mate and some of his crew members. We saw some of this with Gul Dukat and his exploits. And that's a different kind of focus for an episode, a different sort of Star Trek story, but one that this system is perfectly capable of achieving. It's just a little bit more involved from your side as the game master, as you're going to have a little bit more paperwork and a lot more little different stat blocks that you're going to be keeping track of. So if this video was helpful to you, then I hope that you like and subscribe and stay tuned for more content about Star Trek Adventures and other role-playing games off the beaten path. I'm the Complex Games apologist, and let me leave you with these 3 reminders for Starship Combat. Number 1. Ships start with full shields at the beginning of every scene. Ships start with full power at the beginning of every scene, but they don't get it back until the start of a new scene. And finally, don't forget to subtract resistance when you're rolling for damage in Starship Combat. All right, go boldly.